Dear colleagues, good afternoon. I'm very happy to see you again here in the Bank of Russia. We are now starting the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. You might have noticed that our format for today's press conference has changed. We now have an additional speaker on the panel, and that's not only it. The number of the correspondents who traditionally have been participating in this event have been added with well-known video bloggers. And today, finally, we are meeting in person in an offline format, as is the buzzword today, but nevertheless, we do continue to offer online questions from correspondents from other regions and by video bloggers. So to begin with, the Governor will make a statement following the meeting of the Board of Directors. Good afternoon. I'm also very happy to see everyone. Today we have made the decision to decrease the key rate by 3 percentage points to 14% per annum. I would like to remind you that our decision to raise the key rate to 20% was an anti-crisis measure and was made to limit financial stability risks in the first place. Since early April, they stopped to increase. The situation is stabilizing, and this means that we may remove the increment from the key rate that was needed to mitigate these risks. Inflation trends have enabled us to ease monetary policy. The reduction in the key rate will promote the structural transformation of the economy without creating pro-inflationary risks. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our decision. Firstly, inflationary pressure and inflation expectations are declining. The evidence for this is that household soaring demand has diminished and the ruble has strengthened. Over the last 2 weeks of March, inflationary pressure stabilized after its surge in early March. However, it still remains high. In April, households' inflation expectations returned to the levels of mid-2021. According to the surveys of households, expected inflation is below the observed price growth. That is, people believe that prices will no longer rise as fast. Companies' short-term price expectations edged down as well, but they're still higher than last year. The stabilization of inflation expectations and an increase in households' propensity to save mean a decrease in the risk that the inflationary spiral might get out of control. Secondly, economic activity is declining. In the current situation, supply is contracting more significantly than demand. This is what provokes inflationary pressure at the moment. Disruptions in technological production and logistical chains and the termination by some foreign companies of their operation in Russia cause a reduction in the range and availability of many consumer goods. The most illustrative example is the automobile industry. Companies that used foreign raw materials or components are facing problems as they're gradually running out of stocks. The question is how long these difficulties will persist and how quickly businesses will be able to find new supplies and replace the missing links of the production chain. The decline in demand is still more moderate compared to the shrinkage of supply, but might become more considerable. In particular, investment demand is going down because the economic situation is highly uncertain. In such conditions, companies opt to invest available unallocated funds into risk-free assets or return them to shareholders rather than make investments in development projects. Moreover, some investment projects are no longer relevant and thus cannot be completed, whereas companies will need time to prepare new projects. As regards consumer demand, after its surge in late February, early March, people now prefer to save rather than consume. This is evident from both the expansion of ruble deposits and the contraction of consumer lending. In terms of inflation, it is important to consider how demand trends will be changing relative to supply dynamics in the future. During this period, Monetary policy should take into account the processes of adaptation and structural transformation in the economy. They inevitably involve a temporarily higher level of inflation. This is why we have no intention to quickly bring inflation back to the target. Squeezed demand would hamper the structural transformation of the economy. This would lead to a situation where prices would grow slowly, whereas the range of goods and services would become increasingly more limited and some essential products would be simply unavailable. Speaking of monetary conditions, they remain tight. On the one hand, both the ruble exchange rate and yields on federal government bonds returned to the level of mid-February, financial stability risks lowered. On the other hand, the risk premium included in credit rates edged up amid uncertainty. Additionally, banks' requirements for borrowers and collaterals are stricter today, which makes price and non-price lending conditions tighter. The decrease in the key rate will help alleviate this situation to a certain extent. I would now speak on our macroeconomic forecast. The termination of long-term economic relations will have a negative impact on GDP this year. GDP will decline by a range of 8 to 10%, dropping to the lowest point in the fourth quarter. A gradual decrease in demand and supply shocks, monetary policy, fiscal policy, as well as structural measures implemented by the government will promote the recovery of economic growth since the beginning of next year. Due to the high base of the first quarter of 2022, the overall change in GDP next year as compared to the entire 2022 will range from 0 to -3%. The fluctuations are very sharp. Hence, to illustrate future dynamics, it would be more representative to compare the fourth quarter of 2023 against the lowest point of the decline, that is the fourth quarter of 2022. This is exactly why we included a special line in the table of our forecast. We expect GDP to expand by 4 to 5.5% by the end of 2023 as compared to the end of this year. The same is true for household consumption. Although consumption will decline in 2023 against the overall figures of 2022, again, because of the high base of the first quarter of 2022, it will be 4.5 to 6% higher in the end of next year than in the fourth quarter this year. I would briefly talk of the labor market. The situation here is currently quite stable. By March 2022, the employment rate dropped to its record low. Today, the labor market is adjusting to the new conditions primarily through forced leaves, part-time unemployment schemes, and reduced bonuses. However, due to the current transformation of the economy, the labor market has to address new challenges. The structure of employment will be definitely changing, which might require a redistribution of labor resources, both between industries and professions and across regions. We will assess how these processes will influence the pace of the structural transformation of the economy and, accordingly, inflation processes. The situation with the balance of payments has altered significantly. This year, we might see a record high current account surplus reaching $145 billion. However, this is not a favorable situation. It only evidences that the contraction of imports is much more considerable as compared to exports in terms of both their quantities and value. During the next 2 years, trade flows will be partially rerouted. Imports will start to bounce back gradually. Exports will continue to edge down, including due to declining global prices for core exports. This will cause a notable decrease in the current account surplus. Speaking of inflation this year, the main driver will be the factors limiting product and service supply. These are rising costs incurred by companies, including for logistics and rearrangement of their production processes and changes in business models. Supply is contracting more significantly than demand, which is intensifying inflationary pressure. According to our forecast, consumer prices will go up by 18 to 23% over the year, but this figure comprises the earlier surge in prices beginning from late February, which was most significant in March. Future inflation, that is, annual inflation for the next 12 months, will be much lower as of April 2023. Our baseline forecast assumes that it will range from 10 to 12%. Prices will mostly adjust to the changed conditions this year and to a lesser extent next year. As a result, annual inflation will slow down to 5-7% next year and return to the target in 2024. Inflation will decrease and return to 4% owing to the pursued monetary policy. Our forecast takes into account all fiscal policy decisions approved and announced by the government. Updating our forecast in the future, we will factor in all additional decisions as they may have a significant effect on our forecast. Winding up, I would like to talk of possible risks to our forecast and monetary policy prospects. The current situation is extremely uncertain. Simultaneously, supply trends and the factors driving aggregate demand are also changing dramatically. Today, supply is declining faster than demand, but this trend might change in the future. This means that pro-inflationary and disinflationary effects are both possible. Therefore, it is crucial for the Bank of Russia to make prudent decisions, factoring in the changing balance of risks. At the moment, we consider that the scenario where pro-inflationary factors and risks prevail is the most probable one. Nonetheless, the pendulum might swing the other way, and in this case, demand will decline more quickly than supply. This might occur in a situation where consumers still prefer to save as much as possible, while supply already starts to recover. There are also other circumstances that might impact our future decisions. For instance, they might be associated with exchange rate movements and a credit contraction, as well as new external trade and financial restrictions that might occur. Indeed, a lot will depend on the development of the situation that is changing very fast. Hence, high-frequency indicators, both at the macro level and at the industry and regional levels, are becoming increasingly more important. Today, we see room for a key rate reduction until the end of the year. Currently, the forecast range of the average key rate is from 12.5 to 14.7% for this year, 9 to 11% for next year, and 6 to 8% for 2024. However, our actual decisions and time when this decrease might become possible will depend on incoming information, future developments, and further changes in the balance of risks. We will make our further decisions on monetary policy considering that the economy needs to adjust to the dramatically changing conditions. Price stability is always the top priority for us, as it is critical for steady economic growth. Thank you all for your attention, and now Alexei Borisovich and myself are ready to answer your questions. Dear colleagues, let me remind you, do not forget to introduce yourselves and identify your agency. Nastya, you get the first question to ask. Anastasia Sevilla from Interfax. Would you please tell us what kind of inflation you expect to be at the peak and when that peak is going to be registered? And my second question is, the US is currently looking into the possibility of transferring the Russian frozen assets reserves to Ukraine. How realistic it is, since the reserves haven't been confiscated but frozen, and what part of it, what its share is in the US, reserves. You also mentioned previously that claims can be filed. Because of that, at what stage is this particular process? On a different note, could you be able to tell us how the Gazprom Bank will be able to sell the currency that are being paid for as part of the settlements for the Russian gas? The central bank was supposed to come up with its different order and what it is naturally about. As far as inflation is concerned, in annual terms, we do see the peak coming at the end of the year, 18 to 23%, but that is related rather to the fact that the 2023 inflation includes the dramatic growth of prices in the beginning of February, the end of February, beginning of March, as far as sequential inflation is concerned. Most probably we have already passed through that peak, and Mr. Zabotkin might comment additionally on that. Yes, indeed. The maximum monthly price growth occurred in March. That was the biggest one based on any historical records. In April, we will end up having a lower figure, and it is true because the monthly price growth, considering the end of spring and during the summer, is going to be lower than the monthly price growth from last year. Then the annualized inflation will edge up a little bit, but by the autumn, let me remind you that last year, September and October, inflation was already high. So probably during the autumn period, that is when we most probably will overcome the maximum peak of inflation, and towards the end of the year in December, we will be at about 18 to 23%. With regards to the possible confiscation of the frozen part of the Russian currency and gold reserves, we are preparing all of the legal protection measures for any eventuality, which entails quite a big legal and organizational effort. Now, in terms of whether we are sure that we'll be able to resort to this legal protection measures, we ended up being in a situation when many institutions have either been cancelled or are close to being cancelled, and there are no available recipes about how one is to respond to this, but there is a proposal that there should be parity solutions applied towards unfriendly nations and related entities, but this issue is outside of the central bank's mandate. And as far as our strategy and our tactics for legal protection are concerned, there is an active work underway, but I suppose that it's premature to talk about the details. As far as the payment for gas and rubles is concerned, the order of hard currency revenues that are being credited to the accounts in return for the sale of gas have been defined by the presidential decree and by the board decisions and the rules for the authorized banks that have been set in place following these. So the existing order specifically defines the period of time within which the proceeds in return for the sales of gas are to be credited into the account as 2 days since the authorized banks received the foreign currency from buyers. So these rules are available to the gas buyers. They create a very clear understanding that the payment mechanism itself is transparent and balanced. And in the current environment, we do not see the need to introduce change into the established order of things. Yes, we do receive information about concerns on the part of some of the gas buyers with respect to their emerging certain complexities with the conversion of currencies which are being credited to the special accounts in the authorized bank, and as a consequence, a potential inability to pay for gas in rubles. And so with this in mind, I would like to assure that if the established order of interaction between the buyers of gas and the authorized bank is followed by buyers, and no problem emerge for the authorized bank to sell currency at the exchange because of the restrictive measures by the foreign countries, there won't appear any obstacles for payment for the natural gas and the receipt of the natural gas. Thanks very much. Rita now. Thank you very much, Rita Shpilevskaya, TASS agency. Just to carry forward on Anastasia's question, I would like to ask when the regulators expect the material slowdown of the inflation process. And the second question, does central bank consider this year the same kind of bold steps as today to reduce the key rate by additional 3%? Should we wait for this kind of a luxury in the future as well? As far as the stable slowdown of inflation, definitely, we are all interested to see it happen, because the current inflationary pressure, as I mentioned, is declining, but that is after a significant growth of prices throughout February and March. So, well, next, it will all depend upon the way situation evolves, and in the first place, how quickly the supply of goods and services is going to adjust itself, because in many ways this is a very important defining factor. Not the only one, but I would say the most important. In terms of the next steps, yes, indeed, we lowered the key rate by 3 percentage points last time and this time as well. But that was the kind of move aimed at eliminating this markup on the key rate, because when we raised it to 20%, one of the basic factors then was the restrictions to our financial stability as a risk. And so in terms of the current situation, in our base scenario in the future, we do see this being a more weighted moving. And so as part of the base scenario, if you take a look into it, we do envisage the kind of the way when we won't have any room to reduce it further. So it will all depend upon the situation and the way many factors are going to play themselves out. Dear colleagues, next question, please. Ivan, please. Ivan Schligen for Magru. Two quick questions. The first one is about the dividend and the corporate reporting. Should the public companies now disclose their reports and pay dividends? I mean, the Russian companies. And the second question is about non-residents, the foreign investors who have a limited ability to sell the Russian securities. So how long this freeze is to continue, bearing in mind the risk, because if they start to exit, that may create big risk for the Russian stock market. Thank you. As far as the reporting is concerned, yes, indeed, the companies do have the opportunity not to disclose this, and they are making up their mind based on what they see. As far as the dividends are concerned, the same thing applies to dividends as well, because the companies themselves do assess the extent to which it is worthwhile now paying the dividends or not, and that depends upon the situation that a specific company finds itself in, because we do have corporates whose financial results are improving and they can truly afford it, and they are looking with confidence into the future. And that is going to be such a discrepancy because there is a structural transformation of the economy underway, big changes happening with regard to foreign investments into the Russian securities. Yes, the kind of restrictions that we have imposed upon the flow of capital, we are discussing and we are looking into the possibility so that within the S kind of accounts, the non-residents could do portfolio investments into the Russian securities. But this is part of an approach. We're discussing it. But in as far as withdrawing these investments, exiting from these investments, or repatriating these investments abroad, this is not what we are envisaging within the foreseeable future. Olga Shurica, next question from Sebastopol Vesti, Sebastopol Herald. Thank you. I've got another question about inflation. What was the reason behind the fact that in the beginning of March, the prices doubled even for the domestically produced goods, the kind that previously had no hoarding for? One of the reasons behind this price increase was quite an agitated demand with the depreciation of the ruble in the backdrop, but it usually covers a broad range of products, irrespective of whether these products represent imports or they are domestically manufactured. Apart from it, whenever we are saying that these are the Russian manufactured products, that these products may have imported parts or components in them, not very obvious ones, like, for example, with the agent used to whiten the paper, and as a consequence, that brings about the price hike. But what we see that after this active price hike and ensuing demand finished, we are witnessing the prices going down. Good afternoon, Ekaterina Litova, Vedomosti. The Ministry of Finance announced that it is preparing a new fiscal rule. Is central bank involved in the process, and what kind the central bank as a regulator can see this fiscal rule taking shape, and what were the possible decisions that the board of directors considered during its session today? Yes, indeed, such discussions are underway because we believe that in the mid-term perspective we should go back to having such an anchor in the fiscal policy like the fiscal rule we had. But I would suggest that that is going to be a modified fiscal rule because it's early to discuss the details unless Mr. Zabotkin will add something. Well, I believe that the shape that it's going to take exactly is the way the Minister of Finance is thinking about, but the debate around it is going to continue for some time within the process where we are preparing the 3-year-long budget. Yes, I'm definitely going to be actively involved, I hope. As far as the decisions are concerned that we discussed today during the board of directors, primarily there were two options of reducing down to 15% and down to 14% with respect to the key rate. Please, next question. Good afternoon. Dmitry Butrin from Kommersant. I've got two questions. The first one, you partially responded to it, which is the savings standard by households and companies. Most probably the households are going to increase their standard savings, but with respect to the corporates, it's difficult to predict. But how do you see that process longer term, let's say this year and throughout 2023? Will the households, because the statistics do reflect the accumulated results, there are so many factors, but will households be willing to increase their savings? And the same thing about the companies. And the second question is about the ruble. After the introduction of the capital controls, obviously the fact of the price situation is different compared to what it looked before February. Now, what ruble is, considering the fact that the anchoring has changed, should we be taking more note of the payment balance in order to identify how the ruble is going to behave in the future, how inflation is going to be linked to it? Thank you very much. As far as the standards of savings are concerned, it has grown, and against very tough monetary policy, definitely the households are going to demonstrate a higher propensity to save than what they demonstrated in 2020. But as the level of toughness changes and as we get close to our inflation target, I would say that the propensity to save amongst the household is going to go back to approximately the long-term standard. And as far as the corporate savings are concerned, I suppose you mean what the companies hold in their deposit, and I would ask Mr. Zabotkin to comment on that. Yes, a few more words about the households, because there is an additional driver for the households to save, because this is saving with caution. When in a high level of uncertainty, people are trying to save because they suspect that they need some cushion of safety, and this is the kind of behavior that we will definitely be observing within the next couple of quarters, but probably it will then decline as as the country passes through the low point in the economic decline. Well, we're not talking about the corporate savings here. We're talking about the way the companies use their free cash flow or the available funds, because if they don't see any attractive assets to invest into, then the available funds, they're not really accumulating them on their accounts. They're returning them to the shareholders or used to reduce their debt burden, which is a very sensible thing to do. And so it's going to be very different between different industries. Because this is something that we are reiterating many times, as well as the government does, because we are going through the structural transformation, and so the effects of what we might see in different industries are going to be very different and diverse. But in terms of the investment behavior, as you can see from the forecast this year, there is a very strong reduction on the part of the willingness to invest, and the capital accumulation may go down by about 16 to 20%, but next year it will move into the positive area. But following this rationale, in terms of how the corporates behave, it might be similar to the way households are behaving. And as of the next year, the investment demand will be producing the same kind or a significant impact upon the restoration of economic activity. As far as the currency exchange rate is concerned, yes, the set of factors which affect the exchange rate have changed significantly. So in terms of the capital movements, this is being impacted by the trade surplus or trade balance, and the way the imports or exports in this particular case is above the import level, and that is the main driver, although there are certain capital flows that remain. But having said that, when looking at the limitations that the capital flows are demonstrating within the current account, the exchange rate should remain a floating one and should be balanced depending upon how much the exporters are selling and how much the importers are buying. And at the same time, this capital account limitations, they weaken the ability of the capital flows to neutralize the currency exchange fluctuations, so the exchange rate could be more volatile than in an open capital account, and with the fiscal rule mechanisms playing themselves out. So these have been the two elements that primarily eliminated this volatility. And it is also important to bear in mind that whenever we talk about the price stability and about the exchange rate effect impact upon inflation, then the factor of the currency exchange being translated into the consumer prices. So these are facts. I mean, the mechanism itself shall remain the same. It is going to be defined not by the capital account regime, rather by the shares of imports and the costs related to imports. And so, principally speaking, with the import prices remaining stable, the fact of this translation into the ruble denomination should remain as it used to be in the past. But what we can see that apart from the fact that the dollar prices throughout the market are growing, I mean, there's a global inflation, but the import prices for us are also growing because the logistical chain is becoming more expensive. So optically, that might look like a bigger translation, but that reflects in itself other factors related to various, shock supplies. Thank you. Next question comes from online. Alexandra Wald, Life Invest Project. Sasha, please go ahead. Yes, good afternoon. Well, the main purpose for the monetary policy is to protect the Russian citizens' income in national currency. And we see that the real inflation is much higher than what is officially being quoted. And so today it is quite obvious that the policy that is being pursued by the central bank is not sufficient in terms of the measures that are currently being used. And so how this policy may change in the future so as to arrive at the threshold of inflation that you have announced today. Well, indeed, personal inflation in each personal case is different from the statistical ones because individuals have individual structures of consumption, although the structure of consumption on the part of the household is going to change and the methodology to define the consumer price index potentially may be evolving, and we need to take it into account. Now, in terms of the sufficiency of the monetary policy measures that concern inflation, we always say it is the correlation between the supply and demand, and so the core problems currently related to the inflation growing are on the part of supply and the insufficient supply. And the monetary policy impacts the demand. Let's suppose if we dramatically reduce the key rate today, whereby the supply, because of various logistical constraints which are not dependent upon the level of the key rate, also remains low, that would only evolve or transform itself into additional price hikes. So we must be very scrutinous in terms of our monetary policy. What happens on the supply side of things in order not to allow for inflation to heat up and, on the contrary, to ensure stable inflation slowdown. But since we understand that there is going to be a structural economic transformation within this period of time, the level of inflation might be higher than the target. And that is what defines our monetary policy. But nevertheless, the inflation should be going down in a stable way, and that is of a principal importance for the economy, so that there is predictability for all of the economic players, so that there are long-term loans. It is important for there to be confidence in inflation continuously going down to the target level. That is our task. Yes, Mr. Zavodkin, please. Yes, my short comment to this standard notion that inflation is higher than the officially reported. I also must quote the results of the last survey on inflation expectations. Two facts are of an interest. First is that the inflation expectation on the part of the households in April dramatically went down because of the exchange rate stabilization going back to the middle of 2021, something that the governor mentioned in her announcement. But the second, even more curious fact is that the inflation observed by the household based on the survey is 19.9%. The official, the current inflation, the assessment of the annualized inflation from the past week is currently 17.6, which is the lowest gap between what the households observe and the official statement shows for quite some time, which really raises doubts about the extent to which the felt inflation is strongly different from the one that is officially being reported. Thanks very much. Delia, please. Thank you. Elvira Novosti. I've got a question about the reserves. The first one, the central bank disclosed the structure of reserves at approximately March 25th, and then you mentioned that you have prepared yourself that by then to geopolitical risks, having raised the share of gold and RMB up to 50%. Has the situation changed since then? So how much is there gold in your reserves? My first question is, and my second question, the central bank, in its response to the freezing of our results, also introduced restrictions upon the foreign capital movements. Can one expect that this status quo may remain until restrictions are not lifted and our reserves are taken out of the freeze? As far as the structure of the golden currency reserves are concerned, we shall continue disclosing the data about reserves in a bit of a concise version, but with a bit of a lag in time. This is the principles that we're following, so I'm not going to comment right now in terms of how the shares have changed, but you definitely noted that we have resumed our purchases of gold in the market. As far as the restrictions imposed upon capital movement and respectively the assets that have been frozen, we have introduced restrictions on capital movement in the first place in order to reduce the risks to financial stability against the situation where we were not able to undertake currency interventions. And these risks have considerably strengthened. You might have noticed that after that, we had instituted certain measures to soften these restrictions. and we continue to think about it. And our target, our objective, is to have the business which is developing new relationships, enters into the new sales markets, continues to develop foreign activities, to enjoy predictability, to be able to do more of that. In order to reduce the financial stability risks, we have introduced not only the restrictions on capital movement. You may recall that we have also introduced the compulsory sale of currency revenues. One had to sell them within 3 days to begin with, when then we extended it to 60 days, first for the non-raw commodity and then for everyone. And so currently, in what the Government Commission is proposing is to consider the next step for the energy exporters and non-raw commodity sellers. The compulsory sale of currency earnings can be brought down to zeros and down to 50% for the rest of the companies. We also believe that it's important to suspend the compulsory sale of currency earnings if the currency comes from the friendly nations. We also suggested that the exporters who are spending their earnings to buy imports, that they should also be freed from the need to sell their currency earnings. But in as far as the movement of currency and capital is concerned into the non-friendly countries in the foreseeable future, we do not see these restrictions being lifted. Thank you. Yes, Anna? Good afternoon, Anna Lazareva, Russia 24. I have 2 questions. The first one is about the ruble exchange rate. It has gone back to its values in the middle of February. Now, central bank, is it trying to influence it in any way? And if not, when it would be possible to do so? And the second question, because of the stabilization of exchange rate, is it possible to reduce the purchases of currency by the households? Another question, the Kommersant published an article today about the possible consolidation of VTB and the establishment of RNKB. Now, could you comment on that news, please? As far as the ruble exchange rate is concerned, it is being influenced by the established restrictions imposed upon the capital account. There could be certain easings, but the basic one comes from the imports and exports correlation, and the central bank doesn't directly influence that in any way. Now, with respect to the lifting of restrictions, which in terms of until the period of September, in terms of the withdrawing cash, we will continue looking into that, but not at the moment. As far as the consolidation between the banks is concerned, we have supported this decision based on the following rationale. You know, we were preparing the Discovery Bank to sell to the market. We have been working with potential investors, and actually there have been investors ready. But in the foreseeable future, again, we do not see it possible to sell the Discovery Bank, the Equity Bank, to the market. And we understand, we as the banking regulator cannot stay for long as the owners of the bank. And so under the circumstances, we believe this is a common sense decision. Thank you. The next question comes from online. Svetlova, Oriol Grad, Oriol City Information Agency. Good afternoon. The inflation currently is very high. Particularly, you can see that in the regions how you can save one's savings from devaluating. Is there anything that one should invest into these days? Thank you. Yes, indeed, the high inflation does lead to depreciation of savings, and so our task as a central bank to do everything for the inflation to go down, and so for the household savings not to diminish and not to lose their value, and for the market to offer different instruments that people can resort to and invest their savings into. because it really depends upon the kind of an individual situation of an individual person or a family. What is the risk appetite that people may have? What is the planning time frame that people are facing? And so it is important for there to be different instruments, and starting from the deposits. And when we saw that once the key rate was raised and the deposit rates went up again, became more attractive despite the inflation, we noted that the people started taking their money into the bank deposits. Then the securities market should develop, and so basically any assets should be available depending upon situations. People may wish to diversify their investments, but once again, the mainstream thing here is to reduce inflation in order to avoid the risk of the savings losing their value. Yes, Andrei, next one. Andrei Ostro, Reuters. I've got two questions. The first, the Ministry of Finance has just stated that it made a payment on the Euro bonds, which were to be paid for this year and in 1942. Is it correct to understand that Russia was able to avoid the default, or everything will depend upon the bank who is supposed to receive this money? And the second question, how serious today is the discussion of linking the ruble exchange rate to gold? Thank you. Well, as far as the Minister of Finance acting on its commitments and with respect to the debts, I would like to say that the Minister of Finance has the available resources, and so from this point of view, from the economic point of view, the default is out of the question. But there are certain complications in terms of the process of payments that we see, and I hope that all of this will come to successful completion. As far as linking the ruble exchange rate to gold, no, that has never been debated. Dear colleagues, Inna Aldoshina, Pragmatio. My question is about the consolidation between the Discovery Bank and VTB. Is it correct to understand that according to the deal's configuration, the Bank of Russia won't be able to recoup the funds it spent on making the bank healthier? And to what extent the Russian banking sector requires the Basel Committee's standards for oversight? Well, there's no precise configuration of a deal in place, so it's premature to discuss it. But as far as the Basel standards are concerned, the Basel standards, we have been introducing them, but let me underscore that we have been introducing them always very flexibly based on what the Russian banking system required, because many banking system risks in Russia are similar to what you may find elsewhere in the world, and so the methods to control such risk are also very similar. There are certain common approaches, common rules as well, but we have truly been introducing them in a very flexible way. So we're going to look around and see the way the situation is going to evolve and what kind of risks do come forward, which are the ones that are staying in the background, and based upon our objectives, we will adjust and see how stringently we should follow the Basel standards. But I would like to emphasize again, in terms of the capital adequacy, in terms of different other standards, the Basel standards follow very common sense standards related to the banking business as such. So to say that we're going to invent our own will, no, definitely not. We're going to look at the way one should adjust them in the evolving situation. Thank you. Next question comes from online, Kira Yuchtenko, Invest Future Project. Yes, colleagues, good afternoon. I have several questions. The first, if one should expect a negative scenario where the inflation is going to spiral further, is there a probability that regulator shall remain the key rate, which is going to be considerably below the inflation in order to support the economy? Let's say something of a Turkish scenario. My second question, let me step away from the monetary policy issue. It would be great to find out the way the central bank assesses the work done by brokers with their customers in the central environment, and are there going to be any measures undertaken to support the investors who had suffered because of the incorrect work done by brokers, because such thing, unfortunately,
happened. And my third question, if I may, it would be great to understand what are the risks of the Russian investors not being able to buy American or European stocks through the SPB exchange. Understandably, within the sanctional environment, because current situation is a bit strange. For example, when a Russian investor may buy, let's say, stocks of Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and so hearing the kind of rhetoric that there is, it doesn't sound that it's going to be that way forever. Thank you. As far as the negative scenario is concerned, according to which inflation shall stop slowing down and will, on the contrary, it is going to spiral, we will pursue our monetary policy in order to slow it down. What we think is that in order for this structural transformation to take place and for the economy to strengthen, that should take place against the backdrop of a slowing inflation, and our monetary policy is standing upon this undoubted priority, price stability, but understanding the need for the structural transformation of the economy and the time frame that we identify in order to take the inflation down to target, in order to allow the economy to adjust itself as well. But what we expect, as I used to say, that the basic price restructuring is going to happen this year and partially next year as well. Now, with respect to the way the brokers work with investors, yes, we do receive grievances from investors. We are monitoring the market, and we will definitely see and make up our mind in terms of where we should act and interfere. Now, in terms of the way the Russian investors are going to be able to buy foreign stocks, in many ways, this not depends upon our decisions, but upon the decisions made in other countries. But this situation demonstrates that in the case of investors who invest into the foreign stocks, as they say, regulatory risks are very strong, with different freezes, different problems related to payments, so that should be borne in mind. Anna, in the last row, please. I have a few questions, like the rest of my colleagues. The first one, in your speech in the Russian parliament, as well as in today's announcement, there is the basic thing that the monetary policy should be done in such a way so that the importers should benefit from it, who fulfill the government budget, and the importers as well, and the exporters. And I'm not talking about the exchange, ruble exchange rate, but about the kind of a compromise in the area of exchange rate that would be convenient both for the exporters and importers, and also in terms of the ruble exchange rate. In as far as today's decision, it I think reflected something that haven't yet happened, but that is expected: the indexing of the government employees and the pensions. My second question: in one of the first options of the anti-crisis plan, there was a discussion about increasing the insurance coverage in the guaranteed way worth 2 million rubles. Is it being discussed still, or was it only on the agenda when there was a massive outflow of household deposits? And so, with respect to the recent events in Mariupol, the head of the city administration announced that the city started paying pensions and benefits. As far as I understand, the payments are being done in rubles. So the question is whether the central bank is delivering cash to the liberated territories. Are there any problems in that? Was there any need for an additional emission to be able to do that? So many questions. Well, as far as a certain compromise exchange rate is concerned, that is going to be beneficial both for the importers and exporters. I would like to emphasize once again that we're not targeting any particular exchange rate. We are of the opinion that it's really a great benefit to have a floating exchange rate. And so currently it is within the framework of the capital movement restrictions, and there is no need for us to look for any compromise exchange rate. I would ask Mr. Zabotkin to also comment on this particular point, as well as about indexing. Thanks very much. The monetary policy definitely impacts exchange rate. Previously, that impact occurred faster because It was expedited by the interflow in terms of the financials processes is going to take longer right now because the mechanism of the way the key rate is impacting the exchange rate is going to be longer because the credit impacts the demand. The demand impacts the imports, and the imports impact the exchange rate. But as the governor stated, the monetary policy is aimed at ensuring the price stability rather than trying to achieve a certain nominal exchange rate. And as far as the budget is concerned, again, we relied in our decision-making upon the current indications given by the Minister of Finance, which were disclosed in great detail by the Minister of Finance yesterday. And our understanding is that these figures that were announced, like increasing the spending by 4 trillion, entailed certain government expectations towards indexing certain social benefits and other payments. And so we come from these budget macro statistics in our midterm forecast, which in its term was put underneath today's decision-making. Dear colleagues, next question. Oh, insurance payments. Raising insurance payments up to 2 million. No, this was not discussed, but that is the question, not to the central bank. The next question, online, Elena Maslova, the Sense, the Talk portal from the city of Barnaul. Good afternoon. My question comes from the construction industry. The developers, particularly, at least in our region, are saying that their industry, which is the residential development industry, may function quite well when the mortgage loan rate is in between 3 to 7%. I mean, they're quoting different figures, and they're also saying that even against the current key rate, that is practically impossible, even considering the government-offered programs. So can we basically say that the current key rate is an obstacle? Well, first of all, the nominal rates that would have led to higher level of activity in mortgage. Let me give you an example. In 2021, our mortgage rate was 7 to 8%, even higher than that. Higher than the range that you are specifying. But at the same time, the mortgage was actually developing up to 30%. And there are so many mortgage loans, if you may recall, that we were very concerned to see the bubble forming, because that mortgage activity led not to the availability and affordability. In some of the regions, it really went down because the housing prices were very high. Yes, the rates have gone up these days, and many banks were raising them, along with the situation, dramatically in some cases. But as far as the mortgage rate are concerned, because they're long-term rates, what is important for them is the banks trusting having faith in the monetary policy and its ability to reduce inflation, because they are targeting the long-term rates as risk-free investments like the federal bonds. And that reflects the confidence on the part of the market players, their trust towards the central bank to be able to control inflation. And that is very important. And exactly our policy to reduce inflation, to bring it back to the target, will create the necessary conditions for the mortgage lending to broaden. But within this period of time when we're having higher key rates, the government subsidized programs are very much sought after. We know that. We discussed it with the government specifically to support such programs within this period of time. Mr. Zabotkin, please, you wanted to say something? Yes, I simply wanted to once again underscore something that the governor mentioned in her statement. The federal bond rates have already gone back to the levels which we had in the beginning of the end of February, beginning of March. So effectively, in terms of the mid-term, long-term rates, we are already in the kind of a situation that we had before the key rate was raised, and that vividly demonstrates that the level of the key rate should not be directly extrapolated upon the cost of a loan in the economy. And on the contrary, were we not to raise the key rate, if the inflation post-March was not to slow down, believe me, the long-term rates would have been at a totally different level. And the only way to provide for the availability of mortgage and long-term investment resources is to ensure moderate mid-term, long-term rates. Tatiana hasn't yet raised a single question. Yes, yet? Good afternoon, Tatiana Voronova from Frank Media. I've got a question about long-term investments by households. Before this special operation began, there was a presidential decree to incentivize long-term savings, and various ideas were mentioned about the National Pension Fund being funded. Now, does that remain? Because the National Welfare Fund was also discussed as a possibility. Do these ideas are taking any shape, any specific shape these days? Well, I believe that the long-term investments for household is a very valid topic, and that remains, remains as it used to be. But of course, during the period of very intense discussion, we didn't have them. But that is something that we're definitely going to dive into very soon. Mikhail, please. Good afternoon, Mikhail Kuznetsov, Forbes. I've got the following question. Based on our observations, the reduction of this unplanned key rate didn't impact the ruble, but the deposits and the loans have responded to that. But is the central bank planning to do something that the key rate is going to be brought down faster so as to cushion what is taking place in the exchange rates? And on the other hand, to ensure price stability? Well, like I've previously stated, the exchange rate strongly depends upon the exports and imports, but what is very important to consider, and I don't see any discrepancy here, because in terms of the capital flow restrictions we introduced not in order to target certain exchange rate, in order to artificially strengthen the exchange rate, in order to reduce the inflation. We introduced it specifically in order to ensure financial stability and to mitigate the financial stability risks. And so the currency restrictions, this is not about the monetary policy, because whenever we discuss the monetary policy, we discuss the range of decision-making options within the capital flow restrictions that we currently are having. And for the board of directors, whenever we make a decision, it's not choosing this or that, because we make our decision with respect to the key rate based upon our inflation forecast, upon the current status in the economy, the labor market. So once again, the currency restrictions represent the risks to the financial stability, and that is the place for the currency interventions. And we lost the ability to engage in currency interventions. And so in this environment, and to stabilize the situation, you need to have these currency restrictions in place, because you can wind it back. We were not doing the currency interventions in order to target the exchange rate, to strengthen it. We acted through the key rate. The same rationale remains instead of the currency intervention, though we had to apply these restrictions upon the capital flow processes. So there's no discrepancy. So maybe Mr. Zabotkin will add something. No, there's hardly something that I can add. Simply, there's just one way in order to formulate the same idea. The erroneous is the view that after enacting restrictions imposed upon the capital flow as some sort of a new instrument, the central bank started enjoying an additional freedom to pursue its policy, because just one tool disappeared. I mean, the currency interventions, a different one came instead of it, not as a fine one, but the one that pursues the same kind of an outcome, to restrict the capital flow. And so to say that under such circumstances there is a bigger space to choose the more optimum key rate trajectory is not correct, like I tried to explain, because in the end of the day the monetary policy will impact the exchange rate, not momentarily, once we come up with some sort of a statement and investors start moving the flags in terms of where the fair exchange rate should be, but through this chain, because that chain is not a very long one, it's realistically is the kind of question that is the kind of issue that could be muddled within the next 30 days rather than 365 days. The next question we received from Evgenia Pismina from Bloomberg. If the gas exports into Europe stops, what kind of consequences do you envisage for the monetary policy? Have you ever estimated any stress scenarios for this eventuality? Both for the economy and for the monetary policy, yes. I mean, you should try and estimate when that might happen, because in the sectional environment it's difficult to do so because there are so many discussions, so many ideas. But of course, the stress scenario is what we're trying to calculate and estimate. But we're going to present that within our main guidelines on the monetary policy, which we usually do in August. Yes, the scenario with the figures, we will give it a really very hard thought about how to present it by August with the main guidelines, without linking it to any specific case. Conceptually, I would say that the exports shrinking means within a short-term period it's pro-inflationary through its impact upon the exchange rate, but longer term that is the decline in the external demand for the Russian manufactured goods, and the mid-term is disinflationary factor. Dear colleagues, is there anybody who has missed asking a question? Victoria, over there, please. Victoria Shorgina, blogger. Could you please tell us what are the kind of instruments that households may keep their savings when the rates on deposits are lower than the inflation, and the Russian stock market became a very risky one, while the foreign instruments to save and invest are not available? And the second question, is there an understanding when the Euroclear and the Russian clearinghouse are going to re-establish their relations, because the Russian investors are feeling difficulties because of it? Well, indeed, there are different instruments and their relative benefits may change, but with respect to the deposit rates that were adopted in the end of February, beginning of March, were quite attractive, but they were short-term deposits. There's a bit of a decline in terms of the deposit rates, but there are certain tools remaining that could remain attractive to the household. But also, against the inflation easing down, we do expect it to go down further. And so the rates in terms of the future inflation do remain attractive. Many stocks and securities issued by the Russian corporates are being traded in the market. When we relaunched the market, we saw a very significant demand by the Russian investors. It is there, and so this is also something that can be definitely used, and other elements of saving. Some invest into gold. Again, I should say that the tool set for savings is quite comprehensive. I mean, relative attraction within individual tools may change, and so it is very important for investors to assess all kinds of risks that may ensue because of their investing. Now, and as far as Euroclear and National Clearinghouse, no, it's impossible to make any predictions here, sorry. Thanks very much. Next question online, Leonid Romanovich, St. Petersburg, Vedomosti. Leonid, go ahead. Good afternoon. Yes, we understand that the strengthening of the ruble exchange rate creates a certain maneuver ability for central bank, given today's decision, although most of the predictions said that the reduction will go down to 15, but it happened to 14. But I don't see the market really getting excited. The ruble exchange rate is not going down nevertheless. So in such an environment, there is a possibility to maneuver further. Should one expect the key rate to be brought down to 10%? You yourself were mentioning the range in between 12.5 to 14, average throughout the year. It somehow sounds quite modest. Why so? Because am I correct in understanding that the bigger priority is going to be softening the currency restrictions, like in the case of compulsory sale of currency earnings by the exporters? Well, the strengthening of the ruble exchange rate is not the only factor which impacts inflation. Currently, the inflation is being more impacted by the ability to increase the supply as well as the imports, and that is the correlation between the supply and demand. It's like I previously said, we don't have any discrepancy in between these abilities and the options, whether it's the exchange rate or the key rate. I mean, under the monetary policy, we make our decisions based upon the need to reduce inflation, and so that brings about the under the being aware of the need to make sure that the structural transformation is taking place. Now, following the rationale of the currency restrictions, the restrictions on capital movement is something that is quite distortive with respect to the economic policy. It complicates the ability for businesses to operate, particularly as far as foreign economic activities are concerned. It also it increases the exchange rate volatility because it doesn't allow to effectively cushion the short-term fluctuations and the seasonal factor that was previously mentioned by the governor. So the rationale behind introducing them is the risks to the financial stability, and as the financial stability risks are weakening, so to the extent it is sensible, I mean, the regulator and the government are going to reduce the scale of our measures within the currency restrictions, but that is a whole separate decision-making, and it is being dictated by the financial stability considerations, while the monetary policy is being chosen based upon the current level of currency restrictions and the way it translates into our forecast of the payment balance. And with respect to the scale of the rate reduction, a short comment. Let me remind you that the forecast demonstrates the average annual rate 12.5 to 14, and at every point in time, the actual level of the rate could be inside and outside of that range. And I believe that the analysts, if they haven't done so, soon they will come up with their expectations of the key rate curves that would definitely coincide with what we're expecting. But that doesn't mean that the key rate will remain above 12.5% until the end of the year. Dear colleagues, the time for our press conference is coming to an end. Let's have our last question. Tatiana, please. Tatiana Chibasova, Interfox Agency. Further on the consolidation of the VTB and our NKB. Could you still try and explain to us the logic, because this is a very unexpected decision, particularly bearing in mind the kind of announcement that the central bank was making with respect to selling the Discovery Bank to the market investor. Understandably, the situation has changed, but it seems that the central bank has very quickly given up on its plans to somehow try and sell the Discovery Bank stocks differently. Do you envisage any risks for this entity to become a fully government-owned one? And for the future, do you foresee any trend for the banking sector to become, again, enlarged, in order to consolidate some of the smaller players? Is there understanding that some of the foreign players may exit? And what is going to be the landscape? Whereas in the past, the banking sector was quite criticized that it has a big share of government ownership in it. What is the way that it will look in the future? Maybe there will be a bigger share of private players, considering the fact that they're less susceptible to the central risks. Thank you. Well, with regard to this particular transaction is concerned and that particular project, I shall repeat our logic, our rationale. I do not see the possibility in the foreseeable future to sell the Открытие Bank to the market. What does it mean? Because the Открытие, I mean, the Discovery Bank is included into the government sector, and it is not that the government is acquiring it. No. We do see the conflict of interest that many market players were referring to, but we were saying that it was going to be a temporary one because we were imminently selling it into the market, but we currently don't see it being possible. And so, with this in mind, it is correct for the regulator not to continue for an endless period of time to remain the quasi-owner. As far as the consolidation is concerned, yes, such processes may very well be happening, and some serious changes will be taking place. They are already taking place. But our priority should be for the private businesses, for the private banking business to continue developing, so that the private investors may have the opportunity to enter into the bank's equity. Thank you. Thanks very much. Elena Borison is having her birthday. Let's congratulate her.